Good evening from Westminster, where the Prime Minister has once again suffered a heavy parliamentary defeat on her Brexit deal, throwing the government's strategy into further confusion. Now, MPs voted against the deal by 391 to 242. That's a big majority of 149. They'll now be asked to vote tomorrow on whether the UK should leave the EU without a deal on the 29th of March. If they vote against a no-deal Brexit, they will then vote on whether Brexit should be delayed. Labour's Jeremy Corbyn said that the only credible option, in his opinion, was for the Prime Minister to call a general election. Well, tonight we'll have the detail and reaction, and we'll be considering the options available with just 17 days to go before the UK is set to leave the EU. Our political editor, Laura Kuensberg, has the story of the day.
Clear the lobby!
This is what a political disaster looks and sounds like. MPs hurrying here and there, piling through Westminster's corridors, walking through a lobby to say no. For a second time, the Prime Minister has lost her deal, another chunk of authority, and maybe her way.
The ayes to the right, 242. The noes to the left, 391.
The Prime Minister only just hanging on to her voice, hanging on in office right now.
I profoundly regret the decision that this House has taken tonight. I continue to believe that by far the best outcome is that the United Kingdom leaves the European Union in an orderly fashion with a deal. And that the deal we've negotiated is the best and indeed the only deal available.
Exasperated, the Prime Minister will allow MPs to vote tomorrow as they wish to rule out leaving the EU without a formal arrangement. If they do, then on Thursday, they could vote to delay departure. But tonight, it's the Prime Minister asking, then what?
And this House will have to answer that question. Does it wish to revoke Article 50? Does it want to hold a second referendum? Does it want to leave with a deal but not this deal? These are unenviable choices. But thanks to the decision that the House has made this evening, they are choices that must now be faced.
Labour voted against, and now, if it was down to them, they'd fight for a general election.
The Prime Minister's run down the clock, and the clock has been run out on her. Maybe it's time instead we had a general election and the people could choose who their government should be.
Forget the next few weeks. What happens in this circus tomorrow, when MPs can vote to say they won't let us leave without a deal?
If you take the possibility of walking away off the table, you actually end up in a counterproductive situation where you'll get offered terms which you can't accept. So just from a pure negotiating point of view, it wouldn't be a sensible thing to do.
If Parliament does start to dismantle the strategy, I think that makes her position very difficult, and that's a conversation that I think the Cabinet will want to have with the Prime Minister about how long she wants to go on for.
I supported the government this evening, not because I thought the amended agreement was perfect, it was far from it, but it was a step in the right direction.
The Prime Minister still does not want to junk her deal, but the biggest problem was the Cabinet's top lawyer didn't believe the new legal promises from the EU on the deal made an enormous difference. Will it get the deal over the line?
We'll wait and see, Laura.
The tweaks to its most controversial part, the backstop, his raised eyebrow, a question over whether it could really get over the line.
Do you think it's enough for your colleagues?
Because his verdict emerged just as ministers were leaving. While the Attorney-General said the new arrangements would reduce the risk of getting stuck in the backstop, he concluded that the risk remains unchanged, that ultimately there could be circumstances where there would be no internationally lawful means for the UK to leave the backstop on its own.
In my view.
And the opposition even laughing at some points at how he tried to present the deal as new.
The question for the House is whether, in the light of these improvements, as a political judgment, the House should now enter into those arrangements.
Perhaps it would never have been enough for Tory Eurosceptics, who all along have had the power to block Theresa May. Could this deal ever work for them?
52% of the voters voted to leave, but in the House of Commons, probably 500 out of 650 MPs supported Remain. And this disconnect is actually quite troubling for our politics because the House of Commons is ignoring the majority of the British people.
She's not been able to hold back the forces who resist her deal. But ministers tonight say, despite the defeat, the political toll, you guessed it, Theresa May will try again.
Well, that was Laura's report. In a moment, we'll speak to our Europe editor, Katja Adler, in Strasbourg. But Laura is with me now here outside the Palace of Westminster. How do we make sense of what's happened today and to Theresa May's own position now?
Well, it's bad, very bad, no question about that. And there's a long shopping list of reasons why this disaster for the Prime Minister happened and a long list of reasons why it matters. But three main big ones I think worth considering tonight. First, it is a second defeat on her reason for being. Her Brexit plan is the reason that Theresa May gets up in the morning. It's the main job that she has to try to do, and she has failed and failed spectacularly again to get Parliament and her own party on side. The second problem is that she has burned through a lot of political capital here and with the European Union in order even to get this far. So this is another big and important knock to her authority. The third reason why the circumstances of tonight's vote really matter is because in the next couple of days it is entirely feasible, and the Prime Minister's allies fear this, that the government will really lose control of the process, that a series of votes in Parliament will mean that MPs are in charge and she is no longer really able to set the agenda, and she's somehow a hostage to that place behind us.
We'll consider some of the options a little later, Laura. Thanks very much. Laura Kunsberg there for us. Let's go straight to Strasbourg and our Europe editor, Katja Adler. Katja, I think it's fair to say that there is still a view in parts of Westminster that the EU might still be persuaded to move a little in this process. What is the perspective there?
Well, Hugh, EU leaders are sounding very resolute tonight. Michel Barnier, the EU's chief Brexit negotiator, pretty much summed up the mood when he said, "We in the EU have done everything we can. If there's going to be a solution to this impasse, it has to come from the UK." There is no sense in the EU that leaders are blaming themselves for the fact that the Brexit deal was again rejected in Parliament. In fact, leaders point the finger of blame at the UK, at UK politics, and the fact that Parliament wasn't asked at the beginning of the Brexit process what kind of Brexit they could unite around. So the question is, what comes next? Again, the EU leaders look at the ongoing confusion in Parliament and ask what could be achieved in just a few weeks if the Prime Minister now asks for a short extension of the Brexit process. Now, under EU law, of course, Hugh, all 27 EU leaders have to agree unanimously to that extension. They'll probably say yes. They want to avoid a no-deal Brexit. And Theresa May comes face-to-face with all of those leaders at a summit in Brussels next week. Now, will she push them for more? And what will they reply? We cannot be 100% sure at this moment. Certainly, the EU feels that on a technical civil servant level, negotiations have reached a dead end. So any change now from the EU perspective would have to be a political one that can only be taken by the leaders of the 27 EU countries. And they, Hugh, up until now, have been very clear. Yes, they want a Brexit deal, but no, not at any price.
Katja, once again, thanks very much. Katja Adler there, our Europe editor for us in Strasbourg. Well, voters around the UK were watching the result of tonight's vote here at Westminster, and our deputy political editor, John Pienaar, is in Luton, which voted to leave in that referendum nearly 3 years ago. He's been there to sound out the opinions.
Hugh, talk to people about Brexit, and until recently you'd find impatience, frustration, but also plenty of bafflement about what's going on. Tonight, here at the Luton Pool Club, and no doubt many other areas, it's easy to find people with their own clear views of what's gone wrong and where they believe the blame belongs. It's harder than it looks. Not as hard as Brexit, though. Mrs May lost again, a big moment, big enough even to distract players on a big night at the pool hall.
The noes to the left, 391.
It's all such a mess, it's just something else that's not been agreed. So I used to be interested in politics, but now I'm just losing the will to live.
Losing the will to live?
I'm not surprised at the vote tonight. I'm quite happy for no deal.
It's just upheaval for a lot of people and a lot of kind of confusion and mess that doesn't really need to happen, in my opinion.
If we have no deal, then we can set up new deals, and I think that would be a lot easier.
So a couple of years of disruption, maybe that's a price worth paying.
Yes, obviously, yeah.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to set out briefly how
the Prime Minister looked and sounded up against it. Theresa May may be running out of time in number 10. What do you say to that?
If it means that decisions get made, so be it.
You'd be happy to see the back of Theresa May?
Absolutely.
What about you?
No, I feel sorry for Theresa May. She was put in a position where she didn't want to leave, and now she's working on behalf of the country and made a laughingstock.
You think Theresa May's been made a laughing?
Oh, a laughingstock. Her own cost. Her own MPs will not back her, and that's what they need to do. They need to get behind her and back her.
Back here at Westminster, let's have a final word with Laura, our political editor. OK, these two big votes coming up, and then what?
Well, it's a very, very good question. So tomorrow, MPs are likely to vote to say we must not leave the European Union at the end of this month if there isn't a formal deal with the EU that's actually been concluded. That's almost certain to happen. If it does, on Thursday, then MPs have a chance to vote to delay the whole process, to vote for an extension, to use the jargon. It's less clear that will sail through Parliament, but again, it looks likely to happen. But in the meantime, ministers tell me tonight that Theresa May is almost certain to keep going, to try to have another crack, yes, a third attempt at getting her deal through at some point in the next fortnight or so before we are due to leave. After 2 years of investing in this deal and her genuine belief that it is actually maybe not perfect, but the best compromise, she's not suddenly going to junk it overnight, even though a lot of people in that place think it's crazy to continue like this. And the reason why number 10 believes that she really should go on with this, because there is no other easy way out. That place does not agree on any of the other alternatives, whether that is going to a general election, going to a closer relationship with the EU, a softer Brexit, or maybe having another referendum. There's no consensus in there on any of them. But, if you're watching at home tonight, whatever way you voted in the referendum, if you felt that you should be able to trust Parliament to manage this process properly, you would be perfectly justified in wondering whether you'd been wrong to do that.
We'll see what they do tomorrow.
We will.
Laura, thanks very much again. Laura Kuenssberg there, our political editor. And that's all from Westminster on BBC News at 10 tonight.
Good evening. It is true there has been no shortage of high drama in Westminster these past few years, but even so, this was another enormously impactful night in the history of our country. MPs voted a second time, decisively, to reject Theresa May's deal. The defeat, a still massive 149 votes. Brexit's own leaders led the charge against the Prime Minister within their party, and in so doing, may have killed off the last hope of ever actually leaving the EU. Tomorrow, the Prime Minister has promised her MPs a free vote on whether to leave without a deal. If, as expected, the Commons says no thanks to that, then MPs will vote on an extension. In short, Brexit looks all but certain to be delayed tonight, and as to what happens beyond that, well, it really is anyone's guess, because, let's be honest, in more than 2 years, we have barely seemed to advance so much as a yard.
Order. The question is motion number 3 as on the order paper.
Her second chance to persuade MPs to back her painfully negotiated Brexit deal. History in the making for her and us.
The ayes to the right, 242. The noes to the left, 391.
She lost again by an enormous margin of 149 votes. Not as great as her last humiliating defeat, but a disaster by any historical standards.
Order, Mr. Speaker. I profoundly regret the decision that this House has taken tonight.
In theory, therefore, we're leaving the EU in just 17 days without a deal. But in an extraordinary climb down, she tonight announced that tomorrow MPs would have a vote on whether to back a no-deal Brexit that some see as a great opportunity and others say will make us considerably poorer.
This is an issue of grave importance for the future of our country. Just like the referendum, there are strongly held and equally legitimate views on both sides. For that reason, I can confirm that this will be a free vote on this side of the House.
Barely able to speak, she explained why she was in effect offering MPs the opportunity to delay Brexit.
And I'm conscious also of my duties as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and of the potential damage to the Union that leaving without a deal could do when one part of our country is without devolved governance.
They must now accept their deal, their proposal, the one the Prime Minister has put, is clearly dead and does not have the support of this House. And quite clearly, no deal must be taken off the table. We've said that before and we'll say that again. But it does mean the House has got to come together with a proposal that could be negotiated.
MPs coming together is for tomorrow. In the Downing Street win this morning, she was still hoping to end her losing streak as she opened the big debate.
This is the moment and this is the time.
No chance, as those who hate Brexit turned on her.
So, Mr. Speaker, with reluctance and sadness, I cannot go through and allow this further ratchet in the destruction of our country to take place.
As did those who love Brexit.
They have sewed an apron of fig leaves that does nothing to conceal the embarrassment and indignity of the UK.
The big thing that went wrong for her was that her Attorney General told MPs that the UK could remain with the controversial Northern Ireland backstop, those commercial arrangements with the EU to keep open the border on the island of Ireland forever, even though the PM had promised she'd negotiate a way out.
The legal risk, as I set it out in my letter of the 13th of November, remains unchanged.
Once Northern Ireland's DUP MPs turned against the PM's deal, it was dead and buried because she has no majority in Parliament without them. Who does the DUP blame?
The EU insisting upon it has entirely responsible for the difficulties that we find ourselves in. Most people out in the country simply want to get on with dealing with this and are tired of being held to these arcane devices which trap the United Kingdom into arrangements which we could never get out of.
And according to the leader of the Tories' Brexiter rebels, where are we going?
What people are asking for now is certainty. And the great advantage of no deal is it would at last be certain. We would be out, we would be setting our own rules. The necessary arrangements are being rapidly put in place, if they're not already in place, to ensure relatively smooth transition.
A nation a million miles from coming back together, from healing.
The UK, as a result, stands on the brink of a Brexit cliff edge, and Theresa May's government has essentially ceased to function.
But as Theresa May drove home tonight, she knew that in Britain's history, few prime ministers have survived office after the kind of remorseless Brexit failures she's suffered. But if the Brexit mess is unique, so is she. Robert Peston, News at 10.
So, of course, the big question is, what happens next? If you know the answer, you know where to write. And with the sum total of 17 days left before we are due to leave the European Union, what are the chances of that actually happening? Romilly walks us through now what the days and weeks ahead could actually look like.
If Shakespeare had written the story of Brexit, bad weather would be the portent of troubled times. As protesters huddled under umbrellas today and water pooled on Westminster pavements, there's no doubt the Prime Minister is heading for some very turbulent waters indeed. Just as she was fighting for her deal in the chamber, the rain lashed Big Ben, and MPs turned her Brexit plans inside out. So where do we go from here? Tomorrow MPs will vote on no deal, and with Tories now free to vote as they choose, no deal this month at least is likely to be averted, despite the efforts of the Brexit-supporting ERG.
We are significantly closer now, aren't we, to no Brexit, or at the least a delay to Brexit, and it's the ERG who's engineered this situation.
Well, none of the ERG MPs voted against Brexit. If there's a vote against Brexit, that will happen tomorrow, and we will be voting to leave on the 29th of March. If MPs who want to stop Brexit will be trying to take no deal off the table tomorrow, and it remains to be seen if they do that. I accept that it's likely.
With her carefully constructed timetable sunk, the Prime Minister faces having her hand forced on Thursday too, when MPs will vote on a Brexit delay. The EU has already poured water on the idea of an extension without a new direction, but whether it's a few months or longer will be another point to argue over.
3 more months to do what? To just flobber-dob around trying to see if she can persuade a few more members of the ERG to support her deal, when she fails to understand that people won't vote for her deal because they won't vote to make their constituents poorer.
Labour hope any delay would mean a pivot to a softer Brexit.
We do have a sensible alternative Brexit which has been well received in Europe and well received by the experts and is a decent negotiating platform upon which we think we could make progress.
The Prime Minister's deal has taken such a battering now. Is there a chance she could still plough on and bring it back for a third meaningful vote? The EU is not offering her much shelter from the storm, insisting there are no further negotiations to be had. And brace yourselves, some in her party believe there's now only one way out of this.
I suspect we will just have to end up in a general election. I don't see how this Parliament and this government can continue if it can't get its legislation through and if Parliament can't come to a sensible decision.
Isn't the last thing the country wants is another general election?
It probably is the last thing it wants, and my colleagues, it's probably the last thing they want. Everybody's going to get the last thing they want, to be thoroughly miserable.
Quite a thought. By the time the Prime Minister made it home, the clouds had cleared over Downing Street. The political turbulence, though, nowhere near its end. Romilly Weeks, News at 10, Westminster.
OK, well, let's just take a look at the maths behind tonight's vote, which inevitably makes for interesting reading. In the end, 242 MPs supported the Prime Minister's deal, but 391 voted against it to give that huge margin of 149 votes. It's not quite on the scale of her defeat in the last meaningful vote, to be fair, on the 15th of January, but it is still an overwhelming loss. 75 Conservatives in the end defied the party whip to oppose the deal, but only 3 Labour MPs defied their party to support it, perhaps in the end a surprisingly small number. The 11 members of the new independent group all voted against the deal, as we would expect them to do. Now, it is perhaps worth reminding ourselves what really happened tonight. Brexit's leaders fear that the Northern Irish backstop, the decision essentially to put a kind of border in the Irish Sea and lock it there, was going to lead to the slow separation of Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK. That was not a price they were prepared to pay for Brexit. So where does it leave them and indeed all of the rest of us? Robert is here, of course, to talk about this. Can we just talk about you're coming back at the end of the programme for a sort of global view, but can we just talk now on the immediate way ahead? Is there any doubt in your mind that no deal will be rejected by MPs tomorrow?
OK, well, let's be absolutely clear. We're only talking about no deal on the 29th of March. And now I have absolutely no doubt that MPs will vote to take no deal off the table, actually, in just a few days' time, because actually they already signalled that in a vote comparatively recently, a non-binding vote, but this one matters.
Yeah, and does the Prime Minister, how do you think she votes? Does she vote against no deal?
So interestingly, a couple of Cabinet colleagues have told me tonight that she will vote against no deal, which is striking because, as you know, for a couple of years she has said she couldn't take no deal off the table. That said, it is very important to look at the wording of her motion, because her motion does endeavour to keep what you might call the hard Brexiters, those from the European Research Group, on board, because it says even if the EU agrees to take no deal off the table for 29th of March, the default option, if we can't get a deal, is a no deal Brexit.
Logic says if they take no deal off the table tomorrow, we must therefore extend. I guess that's the obvious logic of it. Do you think the Commons favours a short or a long extension?
Look, the Commons is completely divided on this. The Prime Minister, she's already told us, favours a short extension. Those MPs, particularly loads in the Labour Party who want a referendum, obviously want a long extension, so there will be a furious row about this when there's another motion that comes to the House on Thursday, which will debate the length of the motion. But the fundamental point as you know, is this is not something that MPs can determine unilaterally. It's not something the government can determine unilaterally. We do, as a nation, have the power to say it's all been a terrible mistake. We're going to revoke Article 50. We want to stay in the EU forever. But if we just want a delay, we have to beg the EU for it. And we don't yet know what the EU will give us. My hunch is they will only give us a short delay. But I imagine you will be talking to James Mates in a minute or two, and he'll tell you what he thinks.
On which subject? We'll come back to Robert in just a little while at the end of the programme to try and wrap it all up. So turning now, of course, to the question of what happens in Europe. As Robert was saying, really the question is how the EU leaders are going to respond. We know that we need them to agree, so what will they do? James Mace has the story.
A night of carefully choreographed drama in Strasbourg was meant to have avoided all this. The EU genuinely thought they'd done enough that at least the result would be close. This evening, in the same room where a day earlier Mrs May had given her press conference, journalists and MEPs gathered to watch the vote on a big screen. It had all been in vain. The EU's chief negotiator tweeting moments later, "The EU has done everything it can to help get the withdrawal agreement over the line. The impasse can only be solved in the UK. Our no-deal preparations are now more important than ever." Outside the European Parliament chambers, senior MEPs were now expecting a request for an extension to Article 50 to come next week. But they and everyone else here is clear it won't be granted automatically.
Do you expect that if Theresa May simply comes back and says, give us an extension because we need one, she won't necessarily get one?
It must be a united vote of all 27 member countries. They have different opinions about that. I do not know whether that unity is possible. And they have to give reasons very much for that, in which time, for what. And I do not think that Mrs May is able to say that.
The Parliament here is conscious about elections happening in May. President Juncker of the Commission said that an extension for technical reasons might be possible to the election date. So I think we're going to have to look at all of these issues, but I think a bit like today, we've got to take it one day at a time.
The Parliament is scheduled to hold a full debate on Brexit tomorrow, when attitudes to what happens next will become clearer. Extension decisions won't be taken here, but in national capitals. But pessimism is everywhere, with no-deal Brexit increasingly seen as the only way this ends.
So James is joining us now to talk about all this a little more, of course. James, as you probably heard us discussing earlier in the programme, the big question really, what will be the EU's response? What do you think they want? I mean, do they favour a short extension? Do they favour a long extension? Is there any consensus?
It very much depends what for. A coordinated response from Commission, from the Council, from various European capitals tonight saying, listen, in response to this, this is now London's problem, it's not ours, we can do no more. And if there's to be an extension, there has to be a timetable and there has to be a reason. Now, within that, of course, there's a breadth of opinion. In Paris, the view is pretty much only an extension if they want to have an election or a referendum. Berlin, much more sympathetic to giving London more time to sort itself out. But everybody agreed that they don't want Groundhog Day once again. They don't want to just grant a short extension so that Mrs May can go back and have a third go or a fourth go or whatever. They're fed up with that route. If something is going to change in London during the extension period, that is completely acceptable to them if there's no sign of that. And I do think if there was a view to hold a general election or a second referendum, a long extension would be granted on condition that we also take part in the European elections. If that isn't the case, if it's just to be a short one, well, then it has to come to an end on or around the time that those elections happen for various legal reasons, if we're not to take part in them. And this is an important point, and I made it before, but I do think it's worth repeating. A short extension that comes to an end, say, late in May or in June, after the European elections that we haven't taken part in, would not be extendable. That would then be a much sharper cliff edge at that time, because they would not allow us to extend again, because EU law says that if you haven't got MEPs, you can't basically be a member. So that would be a very, very steep cliff edge that would face the end of that short extension period.
OK, James, that's a very good... OK, well, here we are in the biting cold. Here we are again. There seems to be an iron law that political crises always have to happen in sub-zero temperatures. Anyway, let's talk about that. I don't know if you heard the point James made. You neatly threw to James. No, James Mates actually.
Oh, James Mates.
Just when you threw to him, he basically said the trouble is if we go for a short extension, that will be it. There is no further extension after that. Do you think that will weigh on MPs' minds in terms of deciding long or short, or the government's minds anyway?
It will certainly weigh on MPs' minds. As I say, I'm absolutely certain that the Prime Minister will press Parliament to agree to a short extension, because even though she voted for Remain and sort of half-heartedly campaigned for Remain, she is implacably opposed to a referendum. Now, to be clear, she has not given up on getting her deal through. And, let's be clear, this is a very determined...
How many times do we come back? 10, 12, yeah.
And so what her ministers tell me is that her plan is try and get a short extension out of the EU. But having got that, try and put the fear of no Brexit at all into both Labour MPs in Brexit's constituencies and, of course, the Brexiters who voted against her deal today. Yeah. And so she will try and say, look, she'll try and say, actually, James... Obviously, James is not wrong, but she will try and say that on this she would disagree with James. She would say any extension is the beginning of a sort of long process of never leaving the EU. And so she will essentially say, here's my deal. She'll say it again, if you don't take it, then we never leave the EU. Now, for what it's worth, my view is slightly different.
Because we're on the way out. We'll leave that for tomorrow.
I'll tell you what's going to happen tomorrow.
Okay, thank you.
Not that.
Whichever way you look at it, months of negotiations have proved almost entirely fruitless. After tonight's vote, there is still no real sign of what kind of Brexit Parliament wants, as Robert was saying. Only once again, what it will not accept. It will probably be the same again tomorrow, if and when MPs reject a no-deal Brexit. Inside Downing Street, the Prime Minister will be nursing her throat and maybe her wounded political pride. Her Brexit deal is an unwanted child, really, an orphan, even before it was truly born. In the meantime, rivals will be nursing their ambitions to replace her in number 10, a leadership election, a general election. There's something to look forward to. There is one thing we can say. Brexit is drifting on an uncertain political current, and the truth is we have no more idea tonight where we will end up. And tomorrow, and I think we could go on some time on that subject. Robert and I just have, but thankfully we'll be back tomorrow to do it all over again. But in the meantime, good night, and thank you very much indeed for watching. See you tomorrow, same place, same time.